Dr. Howard Gilman, Chancellor of the University of California, Irvine, who kindly stepped in to replace Richard Brookhiser, who was unable to join us for this evening's panel. Chancellor Gilman is an award-winning scholar and teacher with an expertise in the American Constitution and the Supreme Court. He also teaches an undergraduate honors seminar on the topic of religion and the Constitution. We are very honored to have such a distinguished panel of PhDs here with us tonight. This film, which was supported by Irving and Nancy Chase, touches on the First Amendment, civic engagement, and what religious liberty meant in the 18th century, and it also provides a lens to explore anti-Semitism then and today. I would like to thank Irving and Nancy Chase and the Mount Vernon Society for providing us the opportunity to have these critically important discussions at RJCC and supporting us as we convene our community around these topics that are incredibly important today as they were over 247 years ago. As a point of housekeeping, there are note cards and pens located on your table. At the end of the movie or at any time while the panelists are speaking, please write your questions on one of the cards, hold it up, and one of our staff will collect the questions for our panelists. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce Irving Chase, founding chair of the board, and his wife Nancy, secretary of the board here at the Mirage JCC.
We've got more PhDs here tonight than Harvard has in graduation. It's unbelievable. You don't have one. Let's see. I should read better without my glasses. That's scary. Nancy and I welcome all of you to the Mirage Jewish Community Center of Orange County on the Samuel L. Jewish campus. From an early age, I was aware of my Jewish faith and the status as a minority religion amongst others who practice different faiths. As the son of two Holocaust survivors who had suffered the worst of religious intolerance, I learned from my mother and father of blessed memory, by the way they lived their lives, to respect all regardless of their race, creed, religion. This was the American way. What did the American way mean? It meant that as Americans, we enjoyed freedoms unknown to most others. And how did we get those freedoms? A group of men known as the Founders, after years of revolution, war, argument, compromise, enshrined these freedoms in something called the Constitution. The freedom that spoke to my mother and father was the one that allowed them to practice their Judaism without fear or interference from others. Tonight, we'll explore George Washington's role in our nation's pursuit of religious freedom and the current surge of anti-Semitism that has affected our society. I want to thank community leaders Henry and Susan Samueli, University of California, Irvine Chancellor Howard Gilman, and Douglas Bradburn, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, which owns and operates the George Washington Presidential Library and Museum, for graciously agreeing to participate in tonight's program. A very special thank you to University of California Irvine Professor Jeffrey Kopstein for recognizing UCI Chancellor Gilman's legal and academic expertise in the Constitution's Freedom of Religions Clause and coordinating his participation on our program. Chancellor Gilman, thank you for being part of tonight's program on such notice. He agreed this morning, so I really want to make the point of thanking him. He's very gracious to agree to be here. Thanks again. Thank you to the Mount Vernon Ladies Association for recognizing the importance of our program's subject matter, ensuring that the topic is presented tonight and at Mount Vernon permanently through the library's online and in-person reference resources. Thank you to Hal Altman, Board Chair, Scott Braswell, Chief Executive Officer, and Eliza Zabel, Cultural Arts Director from the Mirage Jewish Community Center of Orange County on the Samuel A. Jewish campus for hosting tonight's program. Finally, Nancy and I thank all of you for coming, especially on a wet night. Thank you.
Now I would like to introduce Doug Bradburn, who is the President and CEO of George Washington's Mount Vernon and the former founding director of the Fred W. Smith National Library for the study of George Washington at Mount Vernon. He is an award-winning author and well-known scholar of early American history. Dr. Bradburn is the author of The Citizenship Revolution, Politics and the Creation of the American Union, 1774 to 1804. He is the co-founder and editor of the award-winning book series, Early American Histories. He is recipient of 5 Telly Awards for his work on animated documentaries for use in the classroom. He has appeared on C-SPAN, Good Morning America, CBS Sunday Morning, and the History Channel docudrama Washington. Before coming to Mount Vernon, he served as chair of the History Department at Binghamton University, State University of New York. He received his PhD in history from the University of Chicago and his BA in history and economics from the University of Virginia. Dr. Bradburn.
Well, thank you so much, Irv and Nancy, for that lovely introduction. I want to also thank the board of this extraordinary center and Scott, the CEO. Where's Scott? Yes, thank you as well. I'm delighted to be here. How many people here have been to George Washington's Mount Vernon? That's good. That's very good. We won't name. Sorry about that. It's my first time in front of an audience. I'm very nervous. But, you know, Mount Vernon has been an iconic place for Americans since George Washington gave up his commission and went there. And it is today still the most visited historic site in the country, getting 1 million visitors a year. But it's a lot more as well. Mount Vernon is the historic public history site that people can come and visit. There's 2 museums as well. There's a distillery where we produce George Washington's rye whiskey. There's a grist mill. But there's also the Presidential Library, which opened in 2013. And that ambition came about because the board, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, which is an extraordinary organization, our board is all women. It's been that way since 1858, when they came together and saved the house. It's the oldest historic home group in America. It founded historic preservation. And they did it for a mission that's critical to this nation's survival, which is the idea that if you're going to have a country that governs itself, you have to have an educated citizenry, and you have to understand why choices were made and sacrifices were made, that we would try to create a community together and hand that off generation after generation, what George Washington called a great experiment in human happiness. That's what he called the U.S. Constitution. And that experiment is, I think, under threat today. I don't think we're doing a great job teaching about the things that we share as a nation and teaching how fragile these institutions are that we've inherited. And so the George Washington's Presidential Library was created. It's completely private. It's not part of the National Archives system. Because the idea was like, well, all these modern presidents get their presidential libraries. How about George Washington, our first president, and most important president in many ways? I'm biased. But that goal then, the library allowed the institution to become a leader in research and education as well. So debating important subjects, patronizing work, and helping to produce materials for teachers. And so the film that we're going to watch tonight is the 4th in a series of films that we started making around then. 2 films are on George Washington's military leadership in the war. One is on the creation of the Constitution, called A More Perfect Union. And these are designed to be used in classrooms, listening to what teachers need. Teachers need trustworthy materials. There's a lot of stuff out there, and there's a lot of garbage out there. But MountVernon.org is a trustworthy place. Everything that we do has a citation behind it. Everything comes with a primary source. So these films are created, and they're They're available for free for teachers and students across the country. And Mount Vernon today gets 1 million visitors who come to the place, but we get 20 million visitors a year who come to mountvernon.org, and most of that is coming for our educational resources. So that's incredibly exciting. Now this film, George Washington, The Pursuit of Religious Freedom, really came about because of my conversations with Irv Chase, who's been an incredible supporter of Mount Vernon for many years. He's a history fanatic, loves American history, just came back from Gettysburg and Antietam and Harper's Ferry. He didn't go to the beach, he went to an old battlefield. It's unbelievable. Of course, he lives at the beach, so what are you gonna do? But his passion, he and I share a very similar passion, and that is for this particular story about freedom of religion. Because you think about what makes America different, or the founders' legacy is important. There are many things we can say about how the founders of this nation don't live up to our standards today of individual liberty in class issues, racial issues, and gender issues. They aren't up to the 21st century scratch. And that's okay, we've learned from them and built on them. But when it comes to religious freedom, in many ways they're further along than some of us are today, and many other countries in the world. Because it was really the first creation of a state in which the state didn't control the truth. That was going to be up to the conscience of the inhabitants. And the freedom to practice your own religion was critical to that. And from that freedom of conscience comes all those other freedoms in the First Amendment. Because the idea is the state is not going to control what people believe and what the truth means, which is what kings did in Europe. And so this is going to tell the story of that. Again, the audience is for a student audience, but I think it'll be enlightening for all of us. And I'm very much excited afterward. We'll have up our all-stall panel, and we'll have a great conversation. I do encourage you to write down questions, because I want to get a lot of questions from the audience as well, because we got incredible expertise up here, and I can't think of everything to ask them, I'm sure. So, without further ado, let's have it, the West Coast premiere of the film. Let's go. Everybody, what do you guys think of the film? West Coast premiere. It's LA and premiere a film from Mount Vernon. Well, let's talk about some first impressions from you all here on the stage. We'll start and go over it. Henry, want to start, please?
Obviously, lovely, lovely film. Thank God George Washington was the first president of the United States.
But that was what I said, I had to spell that
That's good.
But I have a solution to all of our problems. All we have to do is resurrect George Washington and make him president, and all our problems are solved.
I know where he is entombed. Susan.
Oh, well, it's such a beautiful film, and I think the ladies of Mount Vernon I can't believe how far-reaching and how they were thinking that in the year that they started this. It's amazing. It's an incredible film, and I think it's something that our students really need to see. I was curious what ages would be watching this film?
Yeah, so in the United States, U.S. history is taught in 8th grade, and sadly, in many states, the colonial period isn't taught unless you're in AP history, AP U.S. history, which is 11th grade. You get it in government classes, and you'll get other things. So, but basically, it's pitched for a high school class is what we went for. Yeah.
And I'll just say it's an extraordinary testament not only to his leadership, but to an absolutely amazing and revolutionary moment in the history of the West, where for 15 centuries it was assumed that government had to align itself with the one true religion and then enforce conformity among its people to that one true religion. This was the only way since the age of Constantine that people thought you could organize a government. And so it's one thing to say, isn't it nice that George Washington had this experience of diversity in the Continental Army and he thought he should be a little bit more tolerant. But that dramatically understates the fundamental transformation in the way we think government should justify its legitimacy, and the way we think government should have some toleration, if not respect, for people of diverse points of view. And so I think the film is, makes the point, but if anything, it underestimates how truly important and world-changing his representation of this fundamental transformation really was. And it's very important for young people and everyone to really understand how important that transformation was.
I think too, one more idea about that is that he was going, at that time, they probably didn't do that, ever enter a church that wasn't their own.
Yeah,
And the fact that he was visiting every religion that existed then,
that's right.
I mean, he is transformative.
Absolutely.
He's a great performer of the presidency, and that's part of what you're seeing as the president. He's playing that role of unifier and trying to find ways to make sure that people can see themselves as one people. But this point Howard makes, I think, is critical about the radical character of what was happening there. I mean, when George Washington, in the opening in the film, is taking that oath,
Right.
he's making an oath where he's saying basically that the Pope is Antichrist. And you have to take that oath to have a position as a magistrate or an officer in the British Empire. It's required. So we take for granted that we don't have to take these kind of test oaths. And that's what's so extraordinary. He grew up in a world where that was expected and kind of mundane, and helped create a nation that would never require those kinds of oaths.
That's right. I mean, not only expected in his era, expected for the previous 14 centuries. How many ideas do you know have existed and persisted for 14 centuries that you're thinking, maybe we don't need those ideas any longer? It was really extraordinary. And just to put a little bit of a point on it, so since the age of Constantine, since roughly the 4th century, every government needed to align itself with the one true religion. Everybody within the jurisdiction of that government had to be forced to conform to that one true religion. And then things ensued, right? And especially in the century and a half, even longer before the creation of the US Constitution, England had been roiled in unbelievably chaotic and bloody and catastrophic battles over what it meant for England to associate itself with the one true religion, right? I mean, the English Civil War ended up killing a higher percentage of English people than died in World War I. And, kings lost their head or fled the realm. People in the tens and tens of thousands had to flee England for a little bit of freedom. And those that didn't launched a revolution against the crown. And it was in that late 17th century period that some people, seeing how completely catastrophic and disruptive politics was the goal of having a government insist that everyone associate themselves with the one true religion, began a little bit to argue in favor of a little bit of tolerance for different points of view. John Milton in the 17th century wrote about this. John Locke at the end of the 17th century wrote a letter on toleration, just beginning to suggest a little bit more toleration. And the amazing history of the American Republic, especially between 1776 and the creation of the American Constitution, fundamentally changed this entire 1,500-year history in a very short amount of time. And that is one of the tremendous fundamental accomplishments of the American Republic, that it completely disassociated the American government from any notion that it was associating itself with the one true religion.
So for the Samuelis, how well do you think this story that we've told tonight is known in the Jewish community generally? You've done obviously a lot of work in educating about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. What about this founding period? Is it thought of as a formative, important story?
Probably not well known. I think the point that Howard makes about how profound the change was that Washington and that administration made is not well known. So I think it would be very helpful for young people to realize, how fragile your society is when you start unraveling what was done 250 years ago. So I think we should do more with young kids to educate them at the significance of that event. It's very significant.
And my guess is that it's probably pretty rare that a teacher is giving this kind of information that Howard just gave. I don't know about any of you, but I don't remember ever learning anything in history like that. And when my girls were going through history classes, and believe me, I was reading their history books with them because I wanted to learn more. I don't think they ever talked about this, and it's really incredible that the United States was able to do this. And if we could be teaching our children this, they might feel, it might come to them more that they should be protecting our religious freedoms, because look what our forefathers did to actually create a country where we could pray any way we want to.
And it extends beyond religious freedoms, and it becomes personal freedoms, social freedoms.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of times it's taught from the present, looking back and saying, well, look how they didn't do it. They didn't do these things that we've come to expect, rather than from the perspective that Howard just pointed out. It's like, look what the world was like that they overthrew, and how far they went, and how much we could learn from that, and then how much we could continue to build on it.
Can you imagine the amount of arguing that went on while they were creating the Constitution?
Well, and just to underscore, I mean, that's a really important point. So it's like, oh yeah, we had this change, and Washington said these things, and everyone was fine, right? Imagine the arguing that was going on. The arguing that was going on is exactly the right thing. As of 1776, many of the colonial governments still had established religions, which then assumed that the people within those colonies would be supporting the one true religion. Many of them shed those establishments, especially the Anglican colonies. 9 of them immediately shed establishments at the time of the Revolution. And then they began creating their own state constitutions, right? And 10 of the new state constitutions that emerged in that period did embrace a notion of freedom of conscience and freedom of religion. But there was still a belief, how could there not be, that we don't entirely trust the government unless the right people are in charge, right? And so by the time you get to the creation of the US Constitution, floating above these states and all of their battles, 3 amazing things happened at the Constitutional Convention. So the first amazing thing is no reference to a deity in the document of the US Constitution. Don't think about the Declaration of Independence, that was 1776. The US Constitution, we the people, so on and so on and so on. There's no notion that the legitimacy of the new federal government was going to be associated with this attachment to a deity. Secondly, Congress is given no authority to legislate at all on any matters of religion. That had never been true in the history of European governments. And third, and most importantly, no religious test for office. And I just want to pause. Of course, you all think, well, there can't be a religious test for office. No one in the history of Europe had ever said that you shouldn't have a religious test before you become a public officer for a government. No one had ever thought that. And during the ratification debates, a lot of people were very nervous about that. And one of the major points of contention during ratification were people who were objecting to the notion that Jews, Muslims, Catholics are going to be allowed to hold office within this government. That was one major source of resistance to ratifying the Constitution. And then, of course, the Constitution was ratified with no religious test for office. It doesn't mean, though, that that notion that we're not quite sure, we don't have a lot of comfort of that, didn't still affect the development of US history, but at least they got that in the actual Constitution, which I think we should not underestimate as an incredible revolution in the way we think about who is allowed to represent us.
Yeah, that's a really spectacular point as well. You know, but there's two sides, I think, to the way these rights and meanings of them work. One is kind of what's the law at a given time and how it's interpreted. And then there's sort of the cultural understanding of what this stuff means. I mean, I think that in Washington's words, which are published in newspapers and people read, there still are established churches in many of the states. There's going to be restrictions on Jews holding office into the 19th century in some places. And so it is this kind of balance between what the culture wants and believes and is aspiring to be, and then what is actually on the books.
I mean, what was very important about what Washington did, and by the way, I printed out every one of the 18 letters that he sent to various congregations in the first year and a half. In case anybody, if you want it, I'll just put it up here. You can look at it. You can also look it up.
And you can find them on mountvernon.org.
And I might have actually found it on mountvernon.org. A tremendous resource. So what he was doing during that time was two main things. For religious majorities, he was conveying the importance of religious liberty, right? So we believe that religion is important. But for religious minorities, he was trying to reassure people of their safety, which is a very different thing, right? So when he was writing to the Jews of Newport, he of course says, you know, happily the government of the United States gives bigotry no sanction. Very important thing to say, right? To persecution, no assistance. England had only been doing persecution for hundreds of years, so that was a nice thing to say. Requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens. But, so, in other words, from the vantage point of the government, we have no hostility. But then he does one additional thing, which was a hope rather than a promise. And he says, and I don't think it was quoted in the movie, may the children of the stock of Abraham, who dwell in this land, continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under their own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. So what's interesting about that hope is that from the vantage point of the formal promise of the U.S. government, we are not going to facilitate any persecution. But then there's this hope that the Jews of Newport will be able to sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, drawing from a biblical allusion. And there shall be none to make him afraid. And that's the interesting question as America evolves. Because the federal government formally was not going to have any hostility. He was also hoping, though, that others would not make the Jewish population afraid. And it's one thing to align the federal government with the promise that it's not going to persecute, but he also extended this hope that the people in their customs and traditions and temperament would be tolerant. And that's a harder thing to make good on. And I think we can all recognize that it was extremely important for Washington to convey that hope, but that hope did not always manifest itself.
Yeah, let's talk about that, I think, because one of the reasons we made this film when we did is the strong, not only to believe firmly this is a story that isn't told well in classrooms, but the rising anti-Semitism that I've seen as a non-Jew in this country who thought we were past this, to see what's going on in the last 20 years, both on the left and the right, in Europe and in America. And so I want to bring in the Samuelis here, you know, who worked passionately against anti-Semitism. Talk a little bit about the work that you do there, and you know, its scope in this country and beyond.
Well, it's a daunting challenge, obviously, and that I don't have any hope we're gonna solve this problem, but I think, you know, it's really, shine a light on it, suppress it as much as you can. I think, you know, you look at the history of the world, and you're not gonna get rid of discrimination, you're not gonna get rid of hatred. You just try to minimize it as much as you can. And the problem is, you know, with social media, the extreme on both sides, it's amplified. So it appears much worse than it may actually be. I mean, we believe it's still rising, but it gets amplified, so you think it's rising faster than it may actually be. And that is where the ultimate challenge is. How do you defeat the extremists who may be smaller in number, but have louder voices than the people in the middle? And you know, you just go at it, you know, one little step at a time. And you've been working in this area for over 20 years in our foundation, and you know, there's hundreds of organizations around the world, and you give splatterings of money to each one, and hope you know, they can make some progress, and they do make some progress, but you know, it's back and forth and back and forth. So we're also focusing a lot, even in our local community, partnering with UCI on several fronts. I think it started, I don't know how many years ago, when Ambassador Michael Oren gave a speech at UCI and was shouted down. So after that incident, we funded a scholarship exchange program between Tel Aviv University and UCI to exchange students and faculty back and forth in the engineering schools, and I believe others as well. They would travel and have a conference one year in Israel and one year here at UCI and so forth, which is still continuing. Then we funded Hillel over the years, and the Rose Project, did some exchange programs, bringing kids to Israel. And more recently, establishing more funding for the Center for Jewish Studies to focus more on anti-Semitism and Israel issues. You know, so we're trying in many different areas, but we don't have any hope that the problem's going to go away.
No, but I think focusing on a specific institution like UCI, creating these exchange programs, I mean, the culture there is probably much improved.
Absolutely, and Howard can speak directly to that, and what the environment was back then, and how it's improved over the years. Maybe you can say a few words about that. That'd be great.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I also want to, you know, Henry and Susan are modest. They do their things. They could work or not work. I do want to say that in moments when the world needs people to stand up, they stand up. And there's, you know, I believe since you know, for the last 10 years, the amount of work that we have put in to address these issues, develop specific programs, facilitate community conversations, be a resource for the community. I mean, some of you know firsthand, people remember things that happened a long time ago, but and you maybe don't always know things that have happened since then, with tremendous partnerships from many of you, that we have worked very hard. And, you know, so the university has created these centers and this work and tremendous academic leaders in this area. But really, over the last couple of years, this is a matter of tremendous urgency, not just in Orange County, but around the world, and you know, in this country. There are, I mean, we've all grown up, and we all knew that anti-Semitism, you know, was a background condition of the world. But you know, I don't remember growing up how proud and bold and Mussolini-like, you know, was the declaration of anti-Semitism in public spaces, you know, in this country that we've seen over the last few years, or this language of Jews will not replace us, and it is just a different thing, I think, than what most of us have encountered throughout most of our lives. And it has, and that's just in the United States, not to mention what's happening in Europe and elsewhere, from the right and from the left and everywhere else. And dear friends, we have to view this as a burning platform. And, the work happening at Chapman, the work happening in a number of institutions in Orange County are really important. And what I want to just convey, because Henry and Susan, among other things, have committed some millions of dollars to our campus for the point of building partnerships with others who want to help us focus more attention on issues of anti-Semitism, Jewish studies, and the like. Our county, the sixth most populous county in the United States, with tremendous academic institutions, we have an ability to build the cultural, intellectual, scholarly capital to make sure that our county is prepared to address these issues, proactively and reactively. And what I would want to say is, I just really want to thank Henry and Susan and others, and Irvin Nancy and others, everyone who is working in partnership with the cornerstone institutions, the JCC and others, the cornerstone institutions of Orange County, to make sure that we're prepared as a county. Because we can't assume that anyone else is going to take care of it. I mean, if we don't take care of it, if we're not in dialogue with each other, if we're not in partnership with each other, if we're not doing a little bit more, then who's going to do it, right? And so I hope you don't mind if, I ask you just to kind of recognize Henry and Susan for their tremendous leadership here, along with many of you, to try to facilitate the kind of work we should be doing together over the next few years to make sure that Orange County is completely prepared to address these issues. And I just want to thank Henry and Susan for all their work.
Susan, what drew you to this work, and how does it look from your perspective right now?
Well, what drew me, I'm Jewish. But I just believe so strongly, as Howard was so passionately speaking about, that we need to work together to solve this problem. Henry and I have given quite a bit of money to a lot of different organizations, but we keep seeing things spiraling out of control. And not only is it frustrating, it's very upsetting. I mean, Henry's parents were Holocaust survivors, and my mother always told me things were going to get bad again. Typical, and she was not a Holocaust survivor. She was, her parents came in the 1900s, but always told me, watch out. And, it's so unfortunate to see what's happening, and that our children might be afraid. I mean, when I hear my daughter's mother-in-law say, don't put a mezuzah on your door just in case, that strikes a chord with me. And so I'm so drawn to this. I so want to educate everyone in the United States that religious tolerance is a must and is something we shouldn't even be talking about anymore. It should just exist. So I love how passionate you are about this topic. I love the fact that there's everyone here in the room that wants to change this. And I think we need to collaborate. We need to figure out how to work together to solve this problem. We don't have the answers yet. I think that's one of the things that frustrates us, because we've done a lot of great things in this community, and we're really proud of what we've done, and we get thanked all the time, and we love to say you're welcome. But if we could take any steps to figure out how to begin solving the problem, I would be thrilled to hear what anybody has to suggest, because this isn't the way we should be living. We shouldn't be this afraid. And for George Washington to say we should not be living in fear, he said that. And we shouldn't be, but we are.
I think, Susan, you're doing it. I mean, education is the key here. It's always the key. I mean, you have to keep hammering on it. And education in civics doesn't end in 7th grade, even if they do it. It's everybody here. It's a continuing responsibility of citizens to continually educate yourselves and help other people. Now, I gotta get to some of these questions or they're gonna riot down here. So I have one, we're sitting here with an eminent constitutional scholar on these issues. Chancellor, a number of questions here related to the current state of religious freedom in the courts.
Yeah.
How does it connect to the debates from the founding period? I mean, is it just about jurisprudence that's evolved from that time? Or are people still sort of talking about, Washington's 2-0 letter, the context of the establishment, non-establishment issues in the founding, and what are kind of the main issues for an audience of what's going on in the courts today over religious freedom? Briefly.
7:05.
Briefly.
Okay. Briefly as I can. So, the founders agreed on some things. No religious test for office. Congress has no authority over established religions. No reference to deity in the fundamental documents. But they didn't resolve every other issue. And just one example of where they disagreed, and then there's a lingering aspect in terms of contemporary debates over that disagreement. And it actually involves Washington in relationship to like Madison and Jefferson. So what did Washington believe that folks like Madison and Jefferson didn't believe? Washington was convinced that a free society could not exist unless the people were deeply virtuous and moral, and the only way for the people to be deeply virtuous and moral would be for them to be religious. And then he believed that the government had a responsibility to promote what I'll call religiosity in the people. And by contrast, folks like Madison and Jefferson believed what it really meant to separate church and state was to view notions of faith as purely a private matter for individual choice and conscience. And the government should have no point of view about it one way or the other. And the way that they put it is that the government should have no cognizance of religion. It should protect religious freedom, but it shouldn't worry so much about whether people were doing one religious thing over another, right? Let the people just figure it out. It's not the government's business. They thought the last 200 years showed that if it was the government's business, it caused a lot of heartache and bloodshed and terrible things. But Washington believed that you needed to promote religiosity in the people. So for example, a couple of examples. As we saw in the film, when Washington was overseeing the Continental Army, he believed it was very important to have chaplains addressing the diverse religious perspectives of the Army. By contrast, when the first Congress hired a chaplain to open congressional sessions with a prayer, Madison and Jefferson thought that was an absolute violation of constitutional principles, right? The government, from their point of view, should not be engaged in religious activity. That's for the people in their private capacity. So a little bit of a difference. Because Washington really believed that you needed to promote religiosity, he thought it was very important for him to do a proclamation encouraging the people to give thanksgiving to divine providence. And so you had these initial Thanksgiving proclamations and made big statements, right, about how every free person and every government should encourage the people to care about actively thanking divine providence. When Jefferson had an opportunity to do that, he said, it's not my job to encourage people. If you want it, give thanks to divine providence, go ahead and do it. It's not the government's job to suggest that. And Madison later in his life said that if government is trying to tell you you have to give thanks to divine providence, and that's almost an establishment of religion. And the last thing actually that Washington did was there is a oath that the Constitution says the president should take before the president takes office. And so you might know the oath. The oath is, under the Constitution it says that I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. That's what the Constitution says. what does Washington say at the end of his first oath taking? So help me God. And so then he establishes then this religious element that was not in the Constitution. So one of the things that we're playing out in contemporary constitutional law is, to what extent should the government actively involve itself in the religious life of the people, promote the religious life of the people, support the religious life of the people, versus whether the government should systematically assure that it's going to be a secular government and allow religious activity to simply be the private choices of individual people. So whether that means prayer in schools, whether that means opening legislative sessions with a prayer, whether that means allowing a public high school, a football coach at the end of a football game on the 50-yard line to encourage his players to participate with him in a final prayer to Jesus Christ, reflecting on the outcome of the game. All of those things are still active. And the difference between a kind of Washingtonian encouraging people for religiosity versus a Madisonian government shouldn't be involved in the practice of religion, that should be a private matter, that is still a very live debate within constitutionalism. And the court for many, many decades had a more separationist approach between whether government should participate in religious activity or not. The modern court, the more recent conservative court, is much more interested in allowing the government to associate itself with religious practices. And I'll just point out that the religious practices that the modern court allows government officials to participate in tend not to be Jewish practices. And so when you allow the government to associate itself with certain religious practices, to open city council meetings with a prayer, I will guarantee you that over 3 years, this one city council will open every single city council meeting with a prayer that will be a Christian prayer, and there won't be a lot of Jewish prayers. And the question is then, given Washington's belief that you should promote religiosity, if you agree with that sentiment, to what extent does that inevitably at some level facilitate the dominance of religious majorities and facilitate also certain conflicts within the political system? But that's one of the issues among many, including free exercise, that the court is currently working through.
Fantastic. And your recent book touches on these issues. Please help.
Well, I don't want to, it's available on Amazon.com. It's, the religion clause is the case for separating church and state. And while Erwin Chemerinsky, my dear friend, and I have a point of view in the book, what I will tell you is that we're so nerdy in terms of teachers, if you really want to know what's going on both in the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause in contemporary constitutional politics, you will learn both sides of the debate, even if after we teach you both sides of the debate, we'll suggest one side as opposed to another.
I've got a lot of great questions here, so let me blow through some of them, and hopefully we can have everybody speaking on these issues. These are very hard questions you've given me to ask.
Is there any math involved?
There's a lot of them. It appears anti-Semitism has grown now, not from what Jews believe religiously, but due to Israel-Palestine issues. Thoughts? Anti-Semitism related to politics with Israel versus some of the old tropes that keep rearing up. Where you see?
Yeah, well, what's I think most disturbing about that is that you have ultra-liberal Jews who are anti-Israel. And how do you reconcile that? I mean, that's something that for me is deeply disturbing. And it becomes very difficult when you're trying to fight anti-Semitism with a Jew. So, I don't know, that one is a very...
But don't you think it's an excuse? I think bringing up the politics is just another excuse to say I'm anti-Jewish.
Even if you're Jewish.
Well, I think they believe in what they believe in. But I just think it's an excuse to talk about reasons to dislike Jews, is to bring up Israel. I don't think the progressive Jews that are worried about the Palestinian and Israeli conflict, they're not anti-Jewish. But the rest, they keep bringing this up. I believe they are anti-Jewish, and they're using it as an excuse. I don't know, just what I think.
So this is a circumstance where I'm talking to my fellow president. Do you want to say a little more, a little less? I'm going to say a little more, but Daniela, you can tell me whether. I know. Go ahead, Howard. I'm right behind you. I understand. Right. There's a far right version of this and a far left version of this. Right. The far right version of this is just traditional, all of the tropes, right? And that's the Jews will not replace us. It views, by the way, the United States, like many other Western countries, as ethno-nationalist Christian countries, and all of the references to Soros and the like. And so that's familiar, and it's shocking that it is so much more conspicuous and overt. But we know that, right? We all grew up with that. Okay. And then there's the left-wing version. The left-wing version sneaks in aspects of these arguments through what they think are merely arguments about anti-Zionism rather than anti-Semitism. Okay. So then it raises a very interesting question about the relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And so just, so you know, as a factual matter, University of California regents 6, 7, 8 years ago, Hal, my fantastic provost, will remind me, debated the question of whether the regents and the University of California should consider all anti-Zionist speech as a form of anti-Semitism. You all have opinions about it. Let me not wade into all those opinions. But what the regents eventually decided was that there might be some arguments against the policies of the State of Israel that aren't necessarily anti-Semitic, but a lot of anti-Zionist speech is a form of anti-Semitism. And so what they said is that the regents decry anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic forms of anti-Zionism. And I don't think that's a crazy way of kind of referring to it, because it does recognize that there are forms of anti-Zionism that are actually, in reality, forms of expressions of anti-Semitism, just partially disguised. So on our campus, we've done a number of events, including inviting Bret Stephens, who I got to know because I'm the co-chair of the UC National Center on Free Speech and Civic Engagement, where he was on the board. He wrote a wonderful column for the New York Times on how anti-Zionism in most circumstances is actually a form of anti-Semitism, had him come to the campus, explain those relationships. I do think that when it comes to addressing a lot of younger people, especially on the left, when they think they're only talking about anti-Zionism with discussions about what they call colonial settlerism, and I mean, you've heard all of these buzzwords, that there needs to be a higher consciousness about the extent to which that language actually should be treated as forms of anti-Semitism. So whether you're dealing with the right or the left, you need slightly different strategies and there's slightly different dynamics, but they are coming from both directions.
Susan, did you want to add something?
I think I'm in over my head.
No, I don't think so. I don't think so at all. Well, there's a number of these that are similar, and I want to get this one out as well, particularly since we have the chancellor here who's an expert on these subjects. How does the lack of civility at the college and university students in any way transfer to anti-Semitism? No one topic stands alone. Should speakers be able to talk and be heard? Look at the recent Stanford issue in the law school, not allowing invited guests to speak. I mean, I think there's a question here related to, well, first of all, civility and conversation, how we deal with any issues, controversial issues, in any spaces, but on college campuses as well, in which you have colleges taking on the role of activists with statements about Zionism or statements about these particular points of view rather than as forums for people to have extreme statements. What are you all seeing in terms of the conversations around anti-Semitism in your work, Samuelis, and also Chancellor? How are you navigating in Irvine these questions of who's allowed to speak and who's allowed to disrupt and what's fair and what's not fair in the forum?
Gee, thanks everybody. So so before
It's all here.
No, it's all great. It's fantastic. So, and I appreciate the opportunity. For the last couple of years, before I started teaching the last couple of years courses every year on religion and the Constitution, I was teaching courses every year on campus free speech. This actually started in 2015 when my dear old friend Erwin Chemerinsky was still the dean of UC Irvine Law School. Erwin and I would teach a class together. We saw kind of what was happening in 2015, and instead of teaching the normal course we taught on the history of civil rights, we decided to teach a freshman seminar on campus free speech, and learned a lot about the frame of mind of students on how they thought about free speech. Students who, by the way, in every situation before they came to the campus, were told K through 12, they believe in tolerance, you should, bullying was bad, and the only thing they were taught in the schools was that you shouldn't say mean things to other people, and if you said mean things to other people, campuses should respond to it. So they were completely expecting at a university setting that that's what campuses would do. And so we learned a lot from them, but we're surprised that they had such little regard for free speech values. So what do a couple of nerdy constitutional scholars do in those circumstances? We write a book, right? So before this book came out, you'll be glad to know the papered edition of Free Speech on Campus is available for you. So Erwin and I wrote a book, Free Speech on Campus, where fundamentally the argument was that there's lots of things that happen on campuses, lots of things campuses shouldn't do, but the one thing campuses could never do is censor or punish someone merely for the expression of an idea. Okay. And it turns out, we saw in 2015, 16, 17, that wasn't a lesson that most chancellors and presidents in higher education understood. Any one of them could give, at the drop of a hat, a speech about the importance of equity, diversity, and inclusion, but none of them could give a really good speech about why you're going to protect speech that some people think is hateful, because it turns out that's not an intuition that most of us have. So the point of the book was to tell people, why are free speech values important? Why are they especially important in campus environments? Why is hate speech, why is hate speech a protected form of speech and not a kind of speech that campuses can react to? And then lots of suggestions for what we should do. And we spent the last couple of years then taking that story to all of American higher ed. And during that time, the University of California decided to create the University of California National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. And Erwin and I are the co-chairs of this national center. So I'm not sure any other chancellor or president has worked as hard as I have worked, really over the last 6 or 7 years, to promote free speech values on campuses. We can talk about Stanford and others. When Yale students decried and tried to shut down a conservative speaker, Erwin and I have an op-ed in the Washington Post, you can look it up, that free speech doesn't include the right to shut down those kinds of speakers. But the work continues, right? Because as we saw at Stanford...
As we'll point out, the Stanford Law Dean quoted from his op-ed today in his statement. So that's one of the reasons.
It is true that when the Stanford Law Dean did a subsequent memo to address what happened at Stanford a couple of weeks ago, it was nice to see that she quoted from Erwin and I's op-ed on why law students shouldn't do what they did.
So for the Samuelis then, are you seeing that, the ability for people to have conversations about this topic being, fraught with all sorts of extreme, dislike of even bringing it up?
Yeah, I think people are afraid to bring it up because you end up with conversations that you can't really, you start arguing and you start having problems with people that you used to have a relationship with.
Yeah.
It's a really huge problem because even in our own family, we have a progressive daughter, and we sometimes get into situations with her that we're arguing about, and, you know, so it's difficult.
Yeah. It is. The young kids, I mean, they have different viewpoints than when I was certainly in school. And it's difficult. I mean, when you sit down and have a rational discussion, they can see your point, but without that, they kind of go in a different direction. You know, you need to, how do you correct them into hearing both sides of the story? They tend to, you know, the misinformation is the problem. There's so much misinformation
And
out
most
there.
of it is on social media.
Exactly. On the internet. That's what they do. They live on the internet, so they tend to believe everything they read. And that's where the problem is. So maybe part of the solution is to instill more work on social media to present the other side of the story, present a more balanced viewpoint. And that's going to take a lot of work because, you know, how do you stand up with billions of posts every day on the internet? So, but that is a challenge, and I think that's an area we will look at is maybe investing more money in to counter social media on one side with a little more rational version of social media.
I would say that most of my friends have kids that are progressive and are having problems talking about this with their kids at the dinner table. I think it's almost 100%, which is really scary.
We'll buy them a copy of our book.
That'll be in their Hanukkah.
Hanukkah, right.
I think to reach them, you need to make a YouTube video. That's the issue. I mean, this is one of the reasons we
Or
are making
TikTok.
films like this. I mean, teachers need support in classrooms to teach these abstract concepts in practical ways. Making films and that sort of thing really help because you know, it's a beginning. It's the film is not the end of the story. It's the opening up of a story that then a teacher can kind of, you know, they can probe it. And here's the primary sources that it's based on. And, you know, and here's the later history that comes out of this. You know, it's critical that teachers have resources that students can consume. I mean, kids can't even read cursive today. So how are they going to read founding writings of people? I mean, you have to think through sort of how do we get at where their literacy is.
Yeah, it's really important that we're teaching the teachers and keeping their minds open. And I think our Jewish Studies program at UCI is doing that. So I'm very proud of them that they have a program where they're reaching out and teaching the teachers.
Yeah.
And I do also want to bring this back to the tremendous work that the Mount Vernon Group is doing. If you're 18 and your instincts are, why are you saying these terrible things about a friend of mine that are so horrible? The institution should do something about it. That is the most natural thing in the world for them to think, right? Because that's all that they've been taught. There's tolerance, you know, that's what we have taught them. It's harder to teach them fundamental civic education. And, you know, we were talking earlier, the very first kind of job I had when I was a graduate student before I ended up being a professor is that I was a grad student way back when it was the bicentennial of the Constitution, and the Center for Civic Education in Calabasas got some money from the U.S. Bicentennial Commission that was chaired by Chief Justice Warren Berger to put together materials for junior high school and high school teachers on what the Constitution means. And so I had a chance to write all of those materials, and I still think that initial step that I made to devote my life in part to helping people understand basic constitutional values and the concept of the American dream and what these founders had in mind and what it means for us is the most important thing that we can do in order to sustain a republic. Because as you remember, Benjamin Franklin, when he was walking out of the Philadelphia Convention and someone asked him, you know, what kind of government did you just create? He, of course, said, a republic if you can keep it, right? And there's nothing natural about whether or not a free society is going to sustain itself. In fact, in the history of the world, if you were going to bet on whether someone creating a free society was going to create something that could be sustained or not, you would bet against it. And the only thing that's gonna make it happen and continue, even in our, especially in our era, is if you continue to teach people what the values are, why they're important, which is why I think the work that's being done by the Mount Vernon Group is so important.
Well, I thank you so much for that, and thanks to the panel for being here. It is this question of what are the values that we share. We spend a lot of time emphasizing the things that make us different, and that's important. We're a great, diverse, wonderful, extraordinary nation, but we also share things, and what we share are values and ideals that we try to live up to, and they come from the stories of our founding and many other stories as well. I have to close. I want to thank our panel. I want to thank Herb and Nancy Chase. I want to thank everybody for coming out here. But what you just were speaking about, we have another big anniversary coming up, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, one of the most important documents in the Western world now. And there's going to be a lot more opportunities to think through, like, what is this experiment and how can we hand it off to the next generation? How can we help them understand its fragility and its purpose? And celebrate those things that we've accomplished together and not constantly berate ourselves for not being perfect. And that's the whole goal, to work together to improve. I think that there's been a very clarifying few years as well. One of the great opportunities I had at Mount Vernon in 2021, in September, President Zelensky and the First Lady Zelensky visited Mount Vernon 6 months before the Russian invasion. And I have a photograph of President Zelensky standing at the Presidential Library with a bust of George Washington looking right at him while he's looking right at a map created by the patriot Fyodor Kościuszko of the Battle of Saratoga. And I also have a photo of them both standing in front of the key to the Bastille, which was sent by Lafayette to George Washington and which hangs in the Mansion House in Mount Vernon. It's been there since 1797 in that same spot. And that key is a symbol of the overthrow of an idea of a state and a tyranny of the kind that Howard was talking about, which is so revolutionary about the world that we all aspire to be a part of. And so it matters for those of us to stand up and talk about democracy because not everybody has it. And we're very lucky to have inherited something that can be improved. And we can't allow things like anti-Semitism and all the things that are against the fundamental values of what we believe to grow at all. And as you say, I think, Howard, nicely, we need to shine a light. And in Washington's letter, he said, we hope for lightness and not dark will be the future. So thank you all for being here. Let's give them a